high, but I'm holding.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Breakthrough.
You're watching Breakthrough.
You are indeed watching Breakthrough News. This is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier. Very happy to be alongside you for you, with you. Wow, I'm struggling right now. Alongside Rania Kalik. That's all I really can say. Rania, good to be back with you.
It's good to be back on with you, Eugene. I love it. I love that sort of open, it makes us remember that you're human.
Well, thank you for that. That's good.
I don't know. Okay, that was to make you feel better.
Thank you. Well, it's sort of like the Matrix, that you have to pretend to be human in order to fool people. So am I really? It's unknown.
I don't know.
Well, either way, good to be back with you here. Obviously, we've got plenty of things to discuss on the show, from the border crisis here in the United States, Ecuador, Ukraine, the Brics meeting, the G7 meeting, the struggle that has erupted after the evisceration of the right to abortion here in the United States. So certainly, if you are watching anywhere, now would be a great time to share this stream. So whoever's following you can follow us. And of course, on YouTube, make sure you take the time to hit that subscribe button. Also hit the bell so that you can get the alerts, so that all of the fantastic things that we have for you here on Breakthrough News will come directly to you. Make it easier for you to find all our fantastic content. So share it, subscribe, like all of those good things. But we want to not get too detained here and just go right ahead and start the show, as it were. And we're very happy to be joined, turning this page, I should say, here to the ongoing struggle in Ecuador. Very happy to be joined by Guillaume Long, who's a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and also the former Ecuadorian Minister of Foreign Affairs and former Ecuadorian representative at the United Nations. Mr. Long, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it appears you're muted.
Oh, you might be muted.
Can you hear us? I don't know if he can hear us. He seemed to be doing this. I don't think, he's not responding. So I think that he cannot hear us.
Oh, he may not be able to hear us.
Yeah.
Well, we'll try to work on this and circle back here, as certainly this is a very important story. 18 days now, mass protest in Ecuador. Maybe we do have Mr. Long back with us.
No, I don't think he can
I can hear you.
Sorry.
Oh,
Oh,
wonderful.
You can hear us. Oh.
Okay.
There's
Well,
an in and out aspect to it.
technological gremlins,
Yeah.
as we like to call them over
I
here.
appreciate that you
News.
have embraced the Gremlins concept.
Oh yeah.
It's a great
Who
story.
couldn't?
It's a great story,
Yeah. Who
as it
couldn't?
were, in the context of things. But yeah, well, obviously, Rania, there's quite a bit going on here in the context of everything, and obviously we're going to talk about it on the show. So I don't want to, prejudge it, as it were. But certainly, we're on day 18 of the uprising in Ecuador, which is what we want to sort of bring to you and hopefully talk more about that. We'll say more. I mean, we can also note that today, June 30th, is a big day for Sudan. Large protests that are happening there, ongoing right now. Well, it's nighttime there now, but earlier they said 5 people had actually been killed by the coup government. I think we might, sorry, I'm getting various different messages here. I think we might have Mr. Long back with us.
Is he? Can you hear us?
Yep, can you hear us, sir?
No, but we can definitely hear him.
We can hear him.
Yeah. It's one of those days, sometimes things just
Sometimes things don't work the way you want them to. That's for sure.
no, that is for sure.
Well,
But,
listen, if that was
what
the
are you
case, I
gonna
don't
do?
know if we'd have anything to talk about week to week, Rania. If things worked out the way
a
we
good
wanted them
point.
to.
That's a good point. Lots of Supreme Court decisions coming through that are just one is
Yeah,
worse than the
yeah.
next.
Well, why don't we just move forward here? I think it's gonna take us a second to work this out. So, one other big issue, Rania, and one that I think it's, we've talked quite a bit about, that's Ukraine, ongoing situation there in Ukraine. I mean, the thing that's most interesting to me, Rania, is how Ukraine has more or less fallen out of the news. I mean, there's been some pretty big news in the United States, but it really does seem to me that since there isn't a clear-cut sort of narrative about Ukraine definitely winning, that all of a sudden it's kind of slipped, down the list in terms of stories.
Indeed, and I think a lot of that actually has to do with the fact that the Ukrainians are not doing well, and that's becoming clearer as Russia takes more territory. You have these sort of weapons-funded think tanks, the Institute for the Study of War, coming up with crazy verbiage to try to describe Ukrainian losses as actually Russian losses. I actually wish there was a tweet I wish I had in front of me, just because the wording is so ridiculous. But I think that's part of it. It's an attempt to ignore what's actually happening on the ground, which is that militarily speaking, I mean, this kind of reminds me of the Syria situation, right? For years, every month, every week, Assad's about to fall, Assad's about to fall, Assad's about to fall, and that never happened. And you kind of have a similar paradigm taking shape with this war, with Russia's about to collapse, the Russian military is about to collapse. Oh, sorry. Okay, I see what's happening. The Russian military is about to collapse. When in fact, that's not what's happening. They're taking more territory again, and it's not looking good for the Ukrainians, who are not only completely dependent on, obviously, an endless flow of U.S. weaponry, but their economy is dependent on an endless flow of money. Their economy is falling apart. And then there's, of course, the consequences for the globe, for the world, which is we see inflation getting worse, which we talked about last week, potentials for a recession. We see a food insecurity growing all across, particularly the global south, gas prices going up. The Democrats are losing popularity. Joe Biden, I think right now, is even less popular than Donald Trump was at this time in the Trump administration. Wow. So there's a lot of reasons to not cover Ukraine. But of course, there's also a lot of things happening domestically that are, I think bigger priorities for most Americans.
Yeah, no.
Even in those in the media.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, rightfully so. I mean, certainly I think Biden has announced hundreds of millions of more dollars for Ukraine today, said that he's going to stay the course with Ukraine as long as it takes. Ursula von der Leyen said the same thing. Of course, President Putin is in Turkmenistan yesterday and today. I don't know if he'll be there longer, but there's sort of a broader meeting happening there. And more or less, he was saying that they are also staying the course, the Russians, he says their goal remains the same, that it's to liberate Donetsk. Now, that's not the full goal he laid out in the beginning piece, but I think, it is notable, as we can see on the ground, Luhansk now almost completely, controlled by Russia and those from the LPR. And now really everything's shifting to Donetsk. The big story today, though, and this speaks to the issue of the grain point that you raised earlier is this Snake Island. I'm sure people maybe have heard Snake Island. It was the one where the Ukrainians allegedly said F you to the Russians, although then I don't know, it seemed like that maybe that was fake or apocryphal. I don't really know. But there's been a huge back and forth over this really tiny island just because of where it sits in the Black Sea. It's relatively strategic. Russia's saying they withdrew as a measure of goodwill to get more grain out of Ukraine, because people remember this is the issue, is Ukraine says, well, we don't want to take the mines out, even though it's our mines that are the main thing preventing grain from coming and going, because Russia is going to take advantage of it and they're going to, find some way to control the Ukrainian coastline more. So Russia's saying they've left as a sign of goodwill to help improve the flow of grain. We know Turkey is negotiating between the two. Ukraine, of course, saying we retook it, we pushed them out, this is a huge victory for us, and so on and so forth. But it does just show that there is so much to play for in terms of the world situation when we're talking about the global grain supply. But there's still that kind of fog of war element about exactly what's happening. But I think it's relatively clear at this point that, I saw an unbelievable Sky News story the other day. It was some Ukrainian Marine officer saying he lost 80% of his troops. So this, it's really becoming a war of attrition now. And I think this is what a lot of people have started to say, even in the US and Europe who are supporting Ukraine, that there will probably have to be territorial concessions. So it's really just a prolongation of the war, it seems, with all these weapons being shipped into Ukraine. Despite the fact that, the US and these others who say they're going to stay until they can't anymore are recognizing they can't really win.
Yeah, and then I think the other element of this is that the U.S. is getting deeper into this war, and maybe they already were deep, but we're learning about it now, right? We learned, I think it was late last week, that the CIA actually has personnel on the ground in Ukraine helping to facilitate weapons flows. We also know the Canadian Special Forces are on the ground in Ukraine doing something similar. I mean, this is not surprising, right? We would have expected this, but that's really dangerous because you have them helping target actual Russian personnel. That really makes the proxy war less of a proxy war and more of a direct war or some kind of gray in between area, which is incredibly dangerous because you have two basically nuclear powers that are confronting each other militarily. But on top of all of that, there is the issue of the Russia, we're going to be talking about this later in the show, but the U.S. is desperate to get the global South on its side. Yeah. It has been desperate for the last 4 or 5 months. Every couple of weeks, you'll see an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post, trying to analyze, why is it all these countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia, aren't on our side, aren't taking our side, aren't taking the West side for freedom. And that's because, unlike during the Cold War, the U.S. and Europe are, I think, in a bit of a weaker position this time around. And especially in terms of the relationships that Russia and China specifically have with a lot of countries in the global South, where they're not willing to throw those relationships away. And for what? To support some proxy war in Ukraine that they want nothing to do with. So I think that's another interesting aspect of this war is there's such a concerted effort to get the global South on America's side. And it's just not happening. Because I'll tell you right now, people in Iraq, people in Lebanon, they don't care. They don't care that there's a war in Europe. I mean, it's sad. It's sad there's a war anywhere, but they're just happy it's not their country. And I mean, this is across the political spectrum, from the pro-Russian people, which definitely exist, to the people who are pro-American. The pro-American side in the Middle East, at least, does not care about this war.
Yeah, it's interesting. You might have seen this. Zelensky had been pestering the African Union to allow them to speak to a meeting. I think this was into last week, earlier this week he did. And I think only 4 heads of state showed up. It might have been 2. I might actually be overplaying the number of heads of state, but it was basically nobody showed. And listen, many African leaders have been pretty demonstratively talking to Putin during this whole thing. Obviously, President Ramaphosa of South Africa called Putin and said, let's increase the amount of business that we do. Central African Republic, the prime minister there was in Russia for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where Egypt, by the way, was the special guest to basically be set up with all these economic deals. But no, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, basically what the U.S. is asking all other countries to do is, I guess, what they've gotten Europe to do, which is cut their own throat and eliminate all of their potential economic prospects. And in the case of countries like India, countries like China to give up what ultimately will help them, which is cheaper energy cost, which will be better for their economy, especially in the context of inflation. So it's basically like ruin your own economy for nothing. I mean, you look at all these summit meetings the U.S. has had recently, and why have they really produced nothing? Well, because the U.S. isn't offering anything. I mean, you know, the U.S. is, depending on how you want to parse it, the largest market, and they don't want to give more market access to countries from the developing world. And there's, you know, a lot to that. There's different elements of how globalization has played out and the negative impacts for working class people here in the United States. But just regardless of that, you know, you're basically saying ruin your own economy and we're going to do nothing to help your economy. And you said we'll talk about this, you know, later in the show, but you have the G7 saying, well, here's $600 billion to counter the Belt and Road. Well, there were $600 billion in Belt and Road initiative programs in 2019. So, you know, obvious, and most of that money is like not even real from the G7 anyway. They're just saying they're going to raise it from somewhere, somehow. And so I think you can see that, I think you're right, Rania, that there is, the position is weaker, and that now at the sort of tail end of this neoliberal era, the reality is the wheels are starting to come off a little bit here. The edges are fraying. This unipolar U.S. system, this race to the bottom in terms of living standards and global rights, the inability to address major issues like climate change, I think is indicative of all of this. That really the attempt to impose this kind of, you know, reality on the world, even people who like the U.S. are just like, well, this is ridiculous. Like, you're saying that you can't just give up a little bit more to resolve these problems. You have to control everything in all places at all times. And if not, you're going to wage a war and sanction everyone and try to destroy the whole global economy over Ukraine. I think for many people that sounds absurd.
Exactly. And then, I mean, it's just like two completely different planets like that people are living on, because then you also have, as this is taking place, NATO expansion. I mean, that's what caused this war in the first place. Like, we don't have to go into that. We've done so many shows, especially you, great shows on the Socialist Program, on Dispatches, so many episodes of the Punch Out, and the Freedom Side as well, like laying out how we got here. And NATO expansion is at the top of that list of how we got here. Yet you have what Finland and Sweden now basically are joining NATO. And now it's official, you know, after decades of supposed neutrality. And I mean, that's in big, you know, quotes, neutrality, because how neutral were these countries ever? I mean, they were completely a part of the, you know, European NATO Cold War infrastructure that's existed, just not official members. But that said, you know, making this kind of dirty deal with Turkey, where, you know, it might be more symbolic or not. There's potential for abuse here, but literally saying they'll extradite wanted members on Turkey's lists of bad PKK people, send them to Turkey, where they would end up definitely spending life in prison, if not worse. That's what Finland and Sweden are willing to do for Turkey to approve them joining NATO, and that's what's happened. And they're doing that in the name of what? In the name of freedom in Europe? You're just going to like throw people into Turkish dungeons potentially for freedom in Europe? I mean, the hypocrisy is just mind-blowing. But, you know, that said, it's like the way the U.S. and Europe are responding to this entire crisis is to basically double and triple down and make it so much worse. And they're dragging the world down with it. Like, you talked about an end of the unipolar world. Maybe not the end, but we're kind of getting to a weaker point of the unipolar world where the U.S. is the dominant hegemon. But that said, like, a country as powerful as the U.S. that has like 1,000 military bases around the world and dishes out so much destruction isn't going to take that lightly or laying down. And I think it's going to be very destructive. That kind of downfall is going to be very destructive for the world. And we're kind of just seeing, you know, the beginning of it.
No, I think that's true. I mean, you know, obviously the Roman Empire was a long multi-hundred-year decline, and it was very destructive, you know, until other hegemons, quote-unquote, could emerge. You know, nothing else could happen because the empire insisted on controlling everything and not changing anything about how they had ruled the world for 1,000 years. And I think obviously it hasn't been that long, but, you know, nevertheless, I think we see here that the ruling elites in the U.S. aren't willing to let it go. I mean, you know, there's an article in the most recent Foreign Affairs, you know, the in-house journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, very influential, some would say the most influential sort of think tank in the broader sphere. In the article, the name of which is now eluding me, but it's something along the lines of, this is the last chance for the U.S. to build a global order, and it's by the guy who's the head of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and some CFR fellow. And basically that's what they're saying is they're like, listen, most people around the world think America acts completely hypocritically against all potential rules. And like, this is our last chance to try to construct a global order that will protect the post-World War II, quote unquote, rules-based international order, where the US makes all the rules and makes everyone follow them. But it's interesting because the article is basically relevant to this, a prescription to get 12 nations, so the US, EU, Japan, Australia, in a G12, they call it. Maybe I left somebody out. And to essentially set that block against Russia and China and try to force all countries to take a side against Russia and China to, I guess, defeat them. They don't really define what that would mean. But it just goes to show how deeply baked in this new Cold War mentality has become, explicitly because these elite figures, certainly in the United States and to a lesser extent Europe, refuse to give up the idea of total global domination and determination of every government in every country and every policy and how it works and so on and so forth. And because of that, it just set the stage for so much more confrontation. And, you know, as I've said so many other times, when you have this level of confrontation, it means you don't have collaboration on other critical issues, nuclear proliferation, climate change, global poverty. And so those things actually get worse in the context of this rise in great power competition. So yeah, looking at Ukraine now, it really does feel, and we said this before, it's in a fight to the last Ukrainian reality from the point of view of U.S. strategy and EU strategy. And, you know, it seems some people in Zelensky's camp, which is really, you know, there's no way they can win, but as long as they can inflict some negative pain on Russia, basically as long as they're killing Russians and at least potentially hurting the economy, at least draining some cash because they have to keep the war effort going, then it's worth it. No matter how many people die, no matter how destructive it is, because nothing is more important than making sure that Russia does not have, forget an international role, even a regional role in Europe in terms of great power relations. Oh, Rania, did I lose you? You might be muted.
I am. You know why I'm muted?
What's that?
It's a funny story. It's not that. It's
Okay.
not that exciting.
Lord.
I had to. I am such a stereotype of a girl. I guess I'm constantly changing the air conditioning temperature, and it beeps every time I do it. So I was trying to be considerate, and then forgot to unmute myself. I apologize.
I'm sure our audience really appreciate it.
Little side note. I'm constantly either too hot or too cold. There's like no in between. Anyways, I don't know if anybody else can relate to that. I'm sure a lot of people can.
I'm sure they can.
That said, but no, I think you're absolutely right. What I was saying, you know, when you can hear me, was that there's also the consequences of what this is doing internally to a lot of these countries. That's quite negative, of course, on top of course, the economic problems and like cutting your throats if you're in Europe or whatever. But there's this McCarthyist attempt to shut down dissent about this war. And this is all under the framework of, you know, combating disinformation. And what's so ironic about it is there's these people who will say Russia and China are so authoritarian. We have to fight like this kind of civilizational ideological war against them. It's democracy versus authoritarianism. And the way to do that is to censor anyone who doesn't agree with us. And that's what's happening, right? How democratic and free. But that's actually, I think, having some serious negative consequences. You know, when I look at the US and just the way that it's kind of like brainwashing people into that sort of like, there's a Russian behind every corner kind of attitude, or there's a Chinese, you know, government official, CCP official behind every corner controlling anybody who's, you know, anti-war. And I think it's happening even worse across Europe because there's such closer like geographic proximity to that. But, you know, the way it's impacting the media environment is really, I think, concerning and alarming, because people like us are just constantly being labeled all kinds of like horrible names. We're Putin apologists. We're useful idiots for Xi Jinping, just because we don't want a Cold War. We don't want a nuclear war. We want a world that cooperates because we're facing like serious existential crises right now. And rather than cooperate, you just have like this crazy thing happening in the US as well, which we're also going to get into at some, with guests later in the show. But like with all these Supreme Court rulings that are coming out, it's like the U.S. is being increasingly controlled by this tiny little cabal of crazy, like theocratic right-wing fascists who are stripping away rights left and right. And I mean, there's the EPA decision that came out that we heard about today, which is extremely alarming. The most powerful country in the world is deciding that their own, regulatory agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, basically doesn't like have any say over regulating greenhouse gases. I'm not sure what the specifics are of it, or I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I saw the headlines and it's just like, this is, I mean, everything happening right now. You have this crazy war that, has the potential to go into nuclear war, but is also causing so much destruction around the world. And then on top of that, internally, it's just the country is, moving further and further away from anything resembling what you could even pretend to call democracy.
Yeah. Well, after some technical difficulties, I think we do have with us now Guillaume Long, who is a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, also the former foreign minister of Ecuador. Mr. Long, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
No, thank you for having me on the show, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm finally with you.
Yeah, no worries at all. This is the world we live in. We're honored to have you here. Ecuador, obviously in the midst of a serious uprising national strike happening now, I think 18 days so far. I mean, maybe just quickly to start, give us a sense of why this uprising, sort of kicked off in the way it did.
Well, it's a series of long-term and short-term factors as usual. It's primarily an indigenous uprising. This is an important factor. So the indigenous group in Ecuador, led by the CONAIE, which is one of the largest indigenous organizations in Latin America, which has a long history of uprisings going back to the early 90s, primarily uprisings against neoliberalism, right? And they actually call it that, and that's what the main cause is, to fight neoliberalism, all the way back to the 1990s being the largest cause. And the last few years we've seen a number of uprisings, particularly two large ones. This one, which is probably the longest we've had in many years, 18 days, 19 days is really long. You're talking about indigenous communities coming down from the highlands up in the mountains at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 meters altitude and coming down into the cities to occupy public space, parks, roads, wherever they can set camp and protest for 18 days, often struggling in terms of logistics, food, access to water, all these kinds of things. So they're very complex operations, and they're very impressive to see. But I was saying this is the biggest one in a few years, but there was one in 2019 also, motivated by very similar demands. Basically, the return of neoliberalism, the rise of the cost of living, privatization of key sectors of the state. The indigenous movement also has a long history of protesting sort of extractivist activities on their territories, such as mining, oil extractions. There are a number of reasons, and in this particular protest, there are 10 specific demands that the indigenous movements have made to the government of Guillermo Lasso.
I'm curious if we can, of course, go back to Ecuador specifically. I just want to kind of, broaden out for a bit. There's so much happening across the region with the sort of rise of movements gaining power, particularly movements on the left, especially people actually winning, in Colombia, for example, but all across the region, Bolivia overthrowing, the fascist coup government last year. People are calling it like a second pink tide. And I'm curious if you think there's perhaps a connection here in terms of just this kind of like, I don't know, movement spread or sentiment spread, inspiration spreads. Do you see a little bit of that happening at all? Or am I just maybe being a little too optimistic and I'm seeing the region?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's certainly happening in Latin America. I don't know whether we can call it a pink tide 2.0 yet, but there's something happening. Let's not forget that roughly from 2014, 2015 onwards, depending what country you look at, what region you look at in Latin America, but for 5, 6, 7 years, you had a return of the right, of conservatives with a very aggressive neoliberal program. As if they hadn't learned any lessons from the first decade and a half of Latin American politics, what we often call the pink tide, and they came back in power with, sort of riding on the wave of the commodities decline, and also some political fatigue after some left-wing governments having been in power for 10 years or whatever. It was inevitable that you were going to get some political fatigue. So the right comes back in, depending on the country, 2015, 2016, 2017. And instead of sort of moving towards the center and saying, right, people are not, I've just had 10, 15 years of something that looks like, depending on what the country you're looking at, it looks like a welfare state, social policies, more equality, less poverty. Let's do something which is a little bit more democratic and a little bit more friendly towards the poorer sectors of society. They came in with an extremely aggressive adjustment program, accompanied by the old recipes of the IMF, a sort of Washington Consensus 2.0. And this has had an impact. And so instead of this working for the conservatives of the region, what we've had is every single election that's been fought since, pretty much, there are a couple of exceptions, but every single election has been won by the left. And you've also seen a massive rise of protests. The year 2019 was the year of the protests in Latin America. Protests in Colombia, protests in Chile, protests in Ecuador, protests in Brazil, protests everywhere. And then, of course, the pandemic came and everybody had to quarantine. You couldn't protest anymore. So there was a return to the private space. And that sort of saved some governments, actually, to be honest. Some conservative governments were saved by the pandemic. But with the end of the pandemic, the problems haven't been resolved. If anything, they've gotten worse. And so you're seeing renewed protests, people taking to the streets again. So what we're seeing in Ecuador is very much part of what you've just described. On the electoral front, a return of the left, which you just saw in Colombia, but where there's no elections, as in Ecuador, because the next elections for a president are in 3 years, you have this frustration being translated into protest now that the pandemic is not quite over, but less of a problem.
Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate that overview, and I think it's very relevant to how we see things emerging and bleeding into, well, that's maybe not the right word, some of the other processes later in the year happening around the region. And in terms of the point you made originally about this, having sort of a revolt against neoliberalism element, I know that the strike has raised the demand, 10 demands, not 10 cents, against some of what Lasso is doing. But talk about what they're demanding and perhaps the state of what's happening with some of the negotiations I believe Lasso has been trying to engage in to calm things down.
So it's a very complicated process because there are, as you said, a number of demands. And it looks like, just in the last few minutes, it looks like there are signs of maybe a potential deal being brokered between the indigenous movement and the Lasso government. The Lasso government just saved itself from being impeached yesterday by 12 votes, right? 137 seats in Congress. You needed 92, which is 2/3 of that, in order to impeach him. The opposition only got 80. They're 12 votes short of an impeachment. This is a government with 17% approval ratings after a year of being in power. The government is in total disarray. So its answer has been essentially sort of a repressive reaction, sort of knee-jerk reaction. On day one of the protest, they didn't even arrest, they literally kidnapped, because they didn't even read him his rights, and it was an unlawful arrest. The head of the indigenous movement, which is like the most stupid thing you could possibly do, is to arrest the head of the protest, the elected representative of the indigenous communities. And then they realized they'd made this stupid mistake, so they released him within 24 hours. But by that time, the protests became much bigger because it was also fighting this kind of authoritarian tendency of the government. So I think now the government after almost being impeached and having made all these blunders and mistakes, is finally sitting down at the negotiating table and making some deals. I think the indigenous movement is also 18 days in. This protest is pretty sort of running out of steam. So I think, realistically speaking, they're also having to sort of compromise. So they're not going to get 10 cents. They're probably going to get 15 cents, which is not really good enough for them. And they've managed to get a process of negotiation going in a number of fronts. There's one of their major causes is to try to get these indigenous communities, essentially peasant communities, which are hugely indebted with banks, right? And if you don't pay the bank on time, then the bank takes away, in some cases your house, your land, so this is one of the major causes of the protest. And so they managed to make a deal with the government that if you owe less than $3,000, I mean, look, $3,000, this is what we're talking about. You owe less than $3,000, there will be a moratorium on that for a while. We don't exactly know how that's going to work, but the last few hours, this is what they're talking about. So those kinds of deals are being made. But, I mean, this is the detail. If you look at the macro picture, we're dealing with a very right-wing government with a very neoliberal program, and people have been used to something different because during the 10 years of Rafael Correa's government, you had exactly the reverse taking place. The relationship with the indigenous movement wasn't always smooth. The indigenous movement wasn't always on the side of Rafael Correa. It's complicated to talk of indigenous movement because there are lots of movements within the indigenous movement, left, right, and people like to talk of the indigenous movement sometimes in rather colonial ways, as if they were all the same. They're not all the same. There are lots of different politics in the indigenous movement. But certainly there was nothing like what we're seeing in terms of protests against what's, a really harsh return of neoliberalism. And if anything, it's made the Ecuadorian people realize, what a real neoliberal government is capable of doing. So, I mean, it's not looking good for the coming months. There may be a deal now after 18 days of protests, but I think it's going to be a very sort of tenuous understanding which could lead to new protests in the future if the real problems are not addressed, and including rising levels of inequality, poverty, the abandonment of the state, of its most essential responsibilities towards its people.
Oh, Rania, you
I thought I'd lost the audio again. I was really worried.
No. I'm just trying to keep everybody on their toes.
Yeah.
I'm also... I figured it'd be a fun little trick.
It worked.
Really play on the drama. No, I mean, I think that's all really well said. And moving forward, I hope things do go well. But I'm just really I'm just curious in terms of Ecuador itself. I mean, there was a bit of a lawfare attack in Ecuador. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that happened across the region. Not everything was like a Bolivia-style coup to sort of unseat those who had pushed for left-wing or maybe, even social democratic style of reforms. There was some more like softer versions of that. So I'm curious if you could just very briefly remind our audience of what happened in Ecuador.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, the return to the right in 2015, 2016, 2017 in Latin America, which is now being reversed, and I think there's going to be a really strong game changer in October when Lula wins the elections in Brazil, because obviously Brazil is a major player geopolitically in the region. And Colombia is also a major game changer because it's associated in everybody's psyche as the US's biggest ally in the region historically, right? So the fact that the Colombia turn to the left is like everybody's flabbergasted in Latin America on the left and on the right is like, what just happened here? This was impossible. Whereas in Brazil, it's possible. It's a big deal. In Colombia, it's also a big deal because of the unlikeliness of it all happening. But anyway, the return to the right in 2015, 2016 was orchestrated in some cases democratically, as I said, because of political fatigue. So the case of Argentina, Mauricio Macri won the elections, okay, fair enough. But in some cases, as you said, they were also sort of very dirty play, including lawfare, which is a very important word. Brazil is the archetypal case, with Lula being jailed essentially so that he couldn't run, he would have been elected, and something similar in Ecuador. Now, Ecuador's You mentioned Bolivia, which is a straightforward coup. In Ecuador is yet another sort of setup because Rafael Correa's heir, a man called Lenin Moreno, who was his vice president, was actually elected. So lots of people on the political left are thinking, wow, this is great. This is contrary to the trend in the region. The left is won the elections and is ongoing in Ecuador. But within 6 months, this new president, who had been elected on a leftist platform, promising, to continue essentially with the policies of his predecessor, had completely turned his coat and sold out, by that time to the Trump administration, and really, really selling out on every single front, policies, but also, as you said, lawfare, persecuting his opponents, and doing a lot of awful stuff like leaving UNASUR, throwing Assange out of our embassy in London, aligning on every single front with the Trump administration, becoming the Trump administration's best friend. The lawfare, its repercussions are still ongoing. So you have former President Correa on trumped-up charges, sentenced to an 8-year jail sentence. Fortunately, he's not physically in Ecuador. And Interpol has actually said that these are politically motivated charges. So Interpol has refused to arrest him. And now Belgium is not exactly a leftist, regime defending revolutionaries worldwide, has granted Rafael Correa political asylum based on the politicization of Ecuadorian justice. So Correa's safe, he's fine. I mean, it's obviously terrible personally for him not to be able to travel to his home country, but the real repercussion, the real consequence of this is that obviously he's out of the picture, he can't campaign in Ecuador, he can't do politics in Ecuador, he's obviously a historic leader, and that's their way of making sure that the left doesn't come back. Last year, Correa's kind of candidate, Andrés Arauz, who had been one of his ministers during the Correa presidency, narrowly lost the presidency. He really won big time in the first round, 33% to Lasso's 19%, but in the second round he was defeated 52-48, with 100% of the media campaigning against him. This is going to be communism, it's going to be Venezuela, it's going to be the usual sort of neo-McCarthyist tropes and all that kind of stuff. But so he lost, but had Correa been in the country, had Correa been the candidate, all those things, same as with Lula, the picture might have been very different. So you're right to say that in Ecuador, it's not just a neoliberal reform and chapter. It's kind of what we call neoliberal authoritarianism. There are very strong authoritarian streaks in this return of this Washington Consensus 2.0.
Mm-hmm. Well, Guillaume Long, Senior Policy Analyst at Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time. I hope everyone goes to cepr.net, because I know you're writing about this and have written quite a bit about the situation in Ecuador, but appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I want to just keep the movement moving on, as my old friend Sean Blackman used to say. And we want to turn to, border issues writ large, which, of course, the eyes of the world have been turned to because of the tragic death of, I think we're up to 50, it may be more, that's when I looked earlier today, migrants who died in the back of a pickup truck just outside of, a tractor-trailer truck just outside of San Antonio, Texas. We're very honored to be joined as we continue the show by the independent journalist Todd Miller. Mr. Miller, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things that in the sort of coverage of this I've been noticing, I think is important. I mean, obviously you have the Governor Abbotts of the world, blaming Joe Biden, saying it's the quote unquote open border. You also got the Biden administration and other Democrats saying it just sort of is a tragedy that, just sort of unfortunate that these kind of things can happen. So, I mean, if you could tell us, what is the sort of border policy that is responsible for this happening? Because I know it can't just be a random tragedy, and why would you have to sneak in a tractor trailer truck if the borders were open?
Yeah, I would say that the border policy literally manufactures these sorts of tragedies. It's very much a part of it. It's been a part of it, a part of the strategy, a central part of the strategy for decades, actually. Like it's a tragedy that happens every day. Occasionally there's something like that happened in San Antonio, where you have a mass event of people dying, where there's a little bit of attention given to it. But this sort of people dying crossing the border. It's a daily event. Like right now, where I am in Arizona, there's probably hundreds of, if not thousands, of people walking through the desert at this very moment, and some of the people do not survive. And the whole policy is predicated. Well, it's called prevention through deterrence, and this policy was originated with the Bill Clinton administration in 1994. And the whole idea when it started was to build up the enforcement apparatus, meaning like, and actually now that this strategy continues, build it up by hiring more Border Patrol agents, building walls and barriers. So if anyone thinks that the first walls are built with Trump, wrong. Built, it goes way back. In fact, the first really serious wall building happened under the Clinton administration. And so building walls, hiring agents, and reinforcing that with technologies. And the whole idea was then to create or make it impossible to cross through traditional places like cities. In other words, people would have to, in order to cross the border, they'd have to go around those cities. So there's different operations: Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Safeguard, Operation Hold the Line on every single border city, sealing off the cities and then forcing people to go into like the Arizona desert, for example, in clandestine fashion. So you're trying to avoid this apparatus. You go into the desert, and the deterrence part of it is that people cannot possibly carry enough water. They cannot possibly carry enough food to make it through the desert to get to where they want to go. So walking through the desert is one thing. Going over to the Rio Grande is another thing. Going into tractor trailer in the backs of trucks, hidden in vehicles, other vehicles, or tractor trailers where lots of people can hide is another way of moving around this surveillance apparatus. So that's why I say it's manufactured. The policy itself creates the tragedy.
Todd, this happened around the same time when I think something like 40 people died on the border between Morocco and Spain, which I know is a border that you have visited for your own reporting on this stuff. And it's just amazing how this infrastructure has been replicated around the world. And so in the Mediterranean, you have people like drowning at sea, which is the deterrence, right? Like they're not going to be able to make it on like a makeshift boat. Oh, am I muted?
No, I'm muted. Or I was.
Oh, okay. That wasn't to me. Sorry, I got a message
full
saying
transparency for our audience. I really just wanted to pour more coffee into my cup, and it was going to be loud, and I didn't want to over your.
No, Todd, we've been having.
I'm just going to do it now. So shout out to the chat.
This has been the audio episode, let me just say. Anyways, as I was saying is, you also had something similar happen within, I think it was almost like the same day or within a couple of days that these two stories were reported, where also something like 40 people died on the border between Morocco and Spain because of this kind of security infrastructure. So I just wanted to raise that just to say how global it is, which is something you've written books on. But can you maybe tell us, like, under the Trump administration, there obviously people were very upset about his racist rhetoric towards immigrants. There was a lot more attention about our border apparatus, about what was happening at the border, people dying at the border, babies in cages, people in cages. Has any of that changed under the Biden administration? What, if anything, has been done to address these issues now that nobody's really paying attention to them anymore?
Well, that's the one thing that's changed. Nobody's paying attention anymore, right? The same things are happening, right? Kids in cages, which was pretty, a kind of buzz phrase during the Trump years. Well, there's still kids in cages, right? But just nobody there there's nobody that talks about it. When Biden came into office gosh, now I can't even remember what year we are. 2020, was it 2021? Has he been there? He's been there that long? Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, he came in with all these promises, right? As part of his campaign, he was going to, stop all the Trump policies. Um, and I looked at that kind of skeptically just to begin with, right? Because, well, he made some executive orders. He's going to stop different policies like remain in Mexico, which is a Trump policy that makes people wait for their asylum cases in Mexico. And he talked about not building another foot of wall. And he talked about, I mean, there's a number of different things. But what he didn't talk about were these long-standing policies and strategies that have been in place for decades that, like, if you look at the border and immigration enforcement apparatus, it's been built up historically over 20 years, over multiple administrations, both Democrat and Republican. Really, as I said earlier, like the deterrence strategy comes out of the Clinton administration. And you look at that, you go, oh, wow, it was a $1.5 billion budget in 1994 for what it was then, the INS it was called. And now, like in 2023, the budget request of the Biden administration is $26 billion, and that's Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. $26 billion. So to put that in context, when Trump started, by the time Trump got into office in 2017, he started with a $20 billion border and immigration enforcement budget. So that was up from 1.5 billion. What does that mean? Well, that means all the money that goes to the Border Patrol, hiring agents, maintaining force, maintaining the guns, bringing in the surveillance equipment, building the walls, all that stuff. Trump had $20 billion that was built up before him when he got into office. And then Biden in 2023, and this is a story that is not being told, is $26 billion. That's $6 billion more than Trump ever had. So Biden can do, the Biden administration can do $6 billion more, you could say, than Trump. And you see it on the border. So even the promises of reversing Trump policies are not really happening. Like there's policies like the pandemic era, Title 42, which rapidly does rapid expulsions of people coming across the border based on the pandemic. It was supposed to be reversed. Biden said he was going to reverse it. Well, it was overturned, and doesn't seem there's like much fight, so it continues on. Remain in Mexico, that policy I mentioned before, it's actually expanding to include Haiti, right? And so you have what I see is almost a more sinister situation where you have a rhetoric that's really tamed down, that's way more humanitarian sounding, that sounds gracious, that sounds like it cares about people crossing the border, but in reality is implementing the same exact strategy, policies, and the same brutalizing people in the same exact way.
You know, one of the things that I think has also come a little bit more into people's controversy, both in the Supreme Court decision, the Egbert v. Boulay, but also I think, you know, in the terrible shooting in Uvalde, people wondering about the rights of the Border Patrol in terms of their law enforcement abilities, you know, that affect all of us, you know, citizen, non-citizen, however it is. Talk about that if you could.
Yeah, that the Supreme Court decision that came a couple weeks ago, that very interesting. Because it pretty much. So what happened was that a Border Patrol agent went into an innkeeper's property in Blaine, Washington. So it was on the Canadian border, and the Border Patrol agent followed him into his property because he wanted to check the immigration status of some people that were staying there. And what happened was that the innkeeper said, "No, I don't want you here. Can you please leave?" And the Border Patrol agent just slammed him against a vehicle and then threw him to the ground. So the innkeeper took him to court on Fourth Amendment, right? The Fourth Amendment, the protection not to be searched nor seized, or that you have to enter somebody's property with a warrant. And so the fact that the Supreme Court, ruled in favor of the Border Patrol agent, that pretty much confirming that the Fourth Amendment means very little in the borderlands. And what I mean by the borderlands, the Border Patrol can operate in a 100-mile zone that goes from the international boundary 100 miles inland. And that's along the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, the 4,500-mile U.S.-Canada border, and along the coast. So say a couple years ago when there was protests in Portland, the Black Lives Matter protests, and all of a sudden this special forces unit of the U.S. Border Patrol shows up named BORTAC, and shows up in unmarked vehicles and starts snatching protesters off the streets into the vehicles. They're allowed to work in that jurisdiction because it's within Portland, technically is in the border zone. So this border zone, like you say, Eugene, it affects us all, right? 200 million people, when you look at the contours of the US and this border zone, live in this border zone. That's 2/3 of the US population. And granted, it is more concentrated on the southern border. We know that. But the fact that it can expand and move, and it's very expansive, and it keeps, as I said, with increasing budgets, the way that its tentacles can go all different directions inland, and as Rania was mentioning, outward as well, right, into other countries, into other borders, and it becomes this huge, right, like, what is this monster, right, that's here? And then on top of that, you have layers of other things like private industry and industrial complex and all these different things you can talk about. But this thing's growing and growing, and people should be concerned.
I see why you named your book Border Patrol Nation. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's like Border Patrol World. Border Patrol.
Yeah, that was going to be the international book. That was my suggestion. Was it Border Patrol World? No, anyhow, go on. I'm sorry.
No, but it's. I wanted to know if you wanted to say anything about what did happen at the border between Morocco and Spain. If you had any comments about that, given that you visited there and you've written about so many other borders around the world, as you say.
Yeah. Well, I know only just a little bit, but I know like on, I believe it was June 24th, so it was 3 days before the San Antonio incident, and about 1,500. The numbers vary from 1,500 to 2,000 African, predominantly Sudanese asylum seekers decided to rush the border, and mind you, we should say the border in Melilla, and that's where they were, in Ceuta and Melilla. It's on the Moroccan coast, right on the Mediterranean, but it's their Spanish enclaves, right? So you go to either of these places and you see a border apparatus, much like you see at the US-Mexico border. There's huge walls. In fact, I've been to Ceuta. You go there and it's almost like a fortress around it. And there's guard towers, kind of like you see in Palestine, Israel-Palestine, like, the kind of pillbox guard towers, and that's on that's what you see around. I don't know if Melilla, I'm assuming it's similar. So what a tactic that people have used is to then run into the through the kind of apparatus, the fortress that's set up, and that's what happened on the 24th. And a lot of times there's a lot of injuries, and I guess there's inquiry to figure out what happened. Right now, officially, 23 people have been. That's the official number. I'm guessing because there are reports that have numbers much higher, that there are many more people who were killed. And I don't know if people caught it, but there's video footage of people just being piled up, living and dead, in just like this area where you just see bodies being piled there, which is one of the most intense, brutal border scenes that I think I've ever witnessed. And I've been looking at this for a long time. And at the same time, that sort of brutality, that pounding brutality of what the border is, it shows that, right? And so that sort of strategy, like, and in the case of Ceuta and Melilla, they're Spain officially. So Spanish Guard is there, I think they're called the Guardia Nacional in Spain. They're there and they're doing the border guard. And then Morocco also gets a ton of funding from the European Union. And so the European Union has been doing this externalization. That's one of their main strategies. So they're pushing out their borders. So you can go to any country like Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia. They're getting Turkey, ton of money from the EU. And on top of that, these countries are also, which is less known, getting money from the United States. But the United States is in there as well. They're in Morocco. They get, like in Libya, which has become a really border hotspot. The United States has done all kinds of border trainings. They've done land border trainings on Libya's southern border. And so the United States and European Union are very much involved, which I think is, probably somebody like me or like who looks into this stuff needs to look into this more. But what I see is like a front, like a cooperation, not only with the externalization of borders coming from the U.S. and Europe, but a cooperation between Europe and the United States, creating this kind of front that is, as you keep moving across the globe, you see this, you have to call a global border apparatus that functions, for lack of a better word, that operates between like the global north and global south, right? That operates, that you have certain countries that are making this happen and creating the same sort of deterrence centered strategy that forces that you look at the Melilla tragedy, some people call it a massacre, and what happened in San Antonio, which also should be considered an aggressive move by the border itself, right? And you see these they're very similar. They connect in that way because this sort of border and its kind of underlying strategies is expanding everywhere.
Well, Todd Miller, journalist and author of Border Patrol Nation, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here at the Freedom Side.
Yeah, thank you. It was my pleasure and honor.
Well, Rania, we want to just keep going here and turn to, another just completely ridiculous situation we're all living in. I guess we're now in the post-Roe world, and I think the aftermath and the ripple effects of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey still with us. And we are happy to have with us to continue the conversation Claudia De La Cruz, who's the co-executive director of the People's Forum, a popular educator, and many other fantastic things. Claudia, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be on the freedom side with Rania and Eugene.
Well, it's the right side of things, that's for sure.
Obviously
we've seen the decision, a number of days of protests. There's about 150, 250 people today in front of the Supreme Court getting arrested, blocking streets. And so obviously the rise of civil disobedience in response to this. We've seen President Biden say, I guess, that he's in favor now of having a filibuster carve out, but under certain circumstances. So, I mean, in terms of where we are now, Claudia, I don't know if this is a question or just throwing this out there. I mean, where do you see this moment and what is to be done, if you will?
I mean, I think it's extremely important to acknowledge that we're living in really explosive times in which there are numerous struggles taking place. And the ruling by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade is one of a huge blow in a list of criminal attacks against the poor and working class in this country. Historically, in moments of multi-layered crisis, like the one that we're experiencing with housing, with homelessness, unemployment, the rising of inequality, inflation, the blatant disregard for human life by the government is of particular historical significance that the most marginalized, meaning women and LGBTQ plus communities, are the ones that are attacked the harder. What we're experiencing with this Supreme Court ruling is a rolling back of civil and human rights that have been won on the streets with struggle by communities that have been protected because they've been under attack since the moment they were given, since the moment we won them. And so we've been protecting these rights for decades. And this is a frontal declaration of war against the working class and poor people in this country. To think that this is only an issue of women, to think that this is only an issue of people who are biologically able to give birth, is to miss the mark. It is important for us to understand that this ruling is claiming further control over our lives, over our bodies, and it's a clear intent to control how and when we reproduce. And this is ridiculous, and it's immoral, and it's criminal. And I speak this not only as a political educator, as an organizer, but I also speak this as a religious leader, as a faith leader. This is completely inhumane. It's appalling. It's outrageous to think that institutions like the Supreme Court have the power to take these actions, that each of these people who represent the elite and their interests have life tenure to play with our lives. The Supreme Court needs to be abolished. Like it needs to.
And I mean,
I think,
that,
well,
oh,
Rania, good. No,
well, no, no,
there's
no.
another
I
one.
didn't mean to interrupt your thought. I think it's like what you're saying is so important and it's so true. And then we see the response to it. And the response has been so muted from the Democratic leadership. Um, Nancy Pelosi like read a poem by an Israeli poet of all poems. Like I've seen a few different interpretations of what that poem is about, but it's not good. It's not a good thing. And then, Joe Biden has been kind of tweeting, we're going to do something. And now he's saying maybe there's room about the filibuster, but it's not quite clear what can be done because Democratic leadership is making it seem like their hands are tied and they can't do anything. But that's not quite true. What can be done?
No.
And what has been the response as you've seen it from Democratic leadership? And what does that mean about that party? A lot of questions.
No. It's on the mark, Rania, and I think it's on the mark because what they're doing is on brand. It is exactly what they have always done, and it's important for us to understand that. And as a people, we need to start acting differently and towards something that is divorced from the Democratic Party, from the Republican Party, that is a movement that is politically independent from parties that are there to serve the interest of the elite. I mean, it is disgusting, but it is a pattern in history that the Democratic Party will work against working class interests, working class values, and the lives of the majority of the people. It is not about saving lives. It is not about, saving children. Biden has the power to make an executive order, and he's not doing it because it's too polarizing, because the Democratic Party has always ceded to the Republican Party. They've always played the part that they're meant to play within the capitalist system. It is a game where every 4 years they decide who will continue to advance the interest of the ruling class. And it doesn't matter whether it is the Republican Party or it is the Democratic Party. Like they really don't have the interest of the working class at heart. It's important for us to understand that this sets a precedent. That it cannot be niched as an issue of women. It cannot be niched as an issue of people who just simply have the biological capacity to give birth. Because this sets a precedent for the rolling back of many other rights that have been gained by struggles of the LGBTQ plus community, workers' rights. I mean, just today I read that there were rulings around climate change. Like they are really looking one after the other to be able to advance the agenda of a ruling class that is there for profit and not for people. I mean, in the United States, women are 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. If we look at the South and we look at Mississippi, a Black woman is 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. And if they really cared about women, about children, especially those in communities that have been historically marginalized, that the Black and brown communities, we would have free childcare. We would have free access to education. We would have affordable and adequate housing. We wouldn't be experiencing shortages like we have of baby formula in the wealthiest country in the world. They would be putting funds for social progress and not for war, right? So with this ruling again, I think looking at what the people's response has been very reflective of the times. It's not only, again, about abortions, it's about everything else that has been taken away. It gives me the sense of the rebellions of 2020 with George Floyd, where there was a convergence of things. And what we cannot allow to do was what we did during the 2020 rebellions, which was leave the streets. We cannot leave the streets. We have to continue to take the streets. We need to deepen our political education processes in our communities. We need to make it known that the issue around abortion rights is an issue of human rights and is interconnected with so many other struggles. And so we need to build broader coalitions that connect all these things that are about advancing our livelihood and our right to a dignified life. And so what is there to do? We need to continue to agitate. We need to continue to educate. We need to continue to organize. And we definitely need to do things differently. We cannot give our lives onto politicians that are not there to protect it, they're not there to care for it, and they're not there to advance what we really need. And so, if you tell me we need a socialist revolution, that's what I think. And we need to start working towards
Right on.
advancing that. We need to start working towards advancing what that would look like, because it's not that we can't. We definitely have everything viable to make a socialist revolution in this country. We do. What we need is to stop conceding and stop giving our power as the masses to politicians that are part of the Democratic Party, that are part of the Republican Party, and who do not care about us. We need to build a politically independent movement that puts the needs of the people front and center.
No, I think the point is very well taken point, and I think it speaks to the sort of broader issue of staying in the streets and the role of political action. Marta Honecker said once that if you want to build political power, you have to first build social power. And I feel in the context of building up a movement that in many ways had become atrophied, I think there's some level of complacency perhaps, given the momentousness. I mean, this is, like Brown versus the Board of Education, Roe v. Wade, these foundational cases. And I say all that to say, to speak to the point that you made about sort of the moral nature of this case. And, I didn't sort of idly mention the people who got arrested today over by the Supreme Court, because, you think about the abolitionist movement, what made it possible for, at least an anti-slavery, if not an abolitionist party, to come to power in 1860, this powerful movement of civil disobedience against slavery, against the Fugitive Slave Act, the so-called higher law concept that it didn't really matter what the law said because slavery was wrong and people should stand up to it. Obviously, the civil rights movement, almost everything done by the civil rights movement in the South was technically illegal, but the sort of gap between morality and legality was exactly what moved the country to change. And I wonder if it feels like a similar moment to you here, Claudia.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the legal system is tyranny. It's criminal at this moment. It is criminal. Like, it is an outright attack towards working class, poor women. And I say that specifically because the elites have always found ways to do what they need to do for themselves. And the systems in place have always allowed for them to do it, whether it's legal or not. And so for us, it's a matter of life and death, and is an orchestrated systemic attack against our lives in every dimension, in every way. And so we need to fight for our lives. And that might imply doing things that go against the very system that oppresses us. I mean, it's not might, it will imply us doing it. It will imply us doing it. And so unless we have the capacity, again, to organize in masses, unless we have the capacity to deeply shift the culture and the understanding around these issues and what our power is, we will not advance. I mean, there's a saying, we only gain what we're organized to take. We only gain what we're organized to take. If we don't organize to take it, they will not give it to us because it's not in their interest to give it to us.
So what you're saying is that giving $15 to Beto O'Rourke is not the way.
Robert Francis O'Rourke, thank you. Let's
Excuse me.
He's not going to let his little
Excuse
brown
me.
face act go on for another electoral cycle.
But no, I mean, I think it's so
Oh,
important what you're saying too, because it's not, of course, like you're saying, it's not just about abortion rights. It's not just about reproductive rights. I mean, we saw in that opinion by Clarence Thomas, like they want to take it
Mm-hmm.
all.
mm-hmm.
They want to strip it
Yeah,
all
yeah.
away. And I know there's another ruling that came through, or I'm not sure. Again, I haven't read all the rulings, but there was talk about voting rights being stripped away, or more the
Yeah,
potential for more
yeah.
voting rights being stripped away because of a ruling. And of course, we saw the opinion about contraception and re-examining, gay marriage. And it's just all of these very regressive things that are going to make it much more difficult for the Pentagon to wave like rainbow flags. Like they have been doing all week, at least in the part of the world I'm in. But that said, I think it's a good, point you're making. So what can people do? Because I think a lot of times, especially with the coverage, like you're mentioning people in the streets, the media is kind of giving some coverage to that, but it's not giving, I think, enough coverage to that because
Yeah.
I'm not in the US right now. And if I'm looking at the New York Times, I don't know that people are really in the streets over this. So for a lot of people who are watching and
Mm-hmm.
might feel helpless, and sort of like hopeless, what can they be doing in this moment to push back against this stuff?
I mean, again, I think that political organization is key. I think one of the ways in which the right and the elite in this country has been allowed to advance is by placing our faith, the masses placing their faith on that political instrument, which is not a political instrument of the working class. Biden talked about, our very privacy is on the ballot. Abortion rights is on the ballot, and it becomes this political charade, this game where people actually do believe that if they vote for the lesser of two evils, life will improve. And, the reality is that that's not the case.
Right.
And so when we're talking about building political organization, we're talking about building the power of the masses and the organizations that represent that. Whether it is a mass organization doing the work of educating in communities, whether it is a political organization advancing a political platform that really does center the people's needs, that's what we need to be building. I think protests are necessary. Taking the streets is necessary. It does something to the collective morale of the people to come together to show our discontent collectively, and also give us power and energy and enthusiasm to be able to do the day-to-day work that needs to happen. So the protest is not the last thing. It's actually a way of kind of raising the mystica, the morale of the struggle, to then continue to do the work that needs to be done on the day-to-day basis. And one individual cannot do that by themselves. We need to do it within organizations. And no one organization alone can advance it. That's why coalition building is necessary. And when we're talking about cross sectoral organizing of coalitions, is understanding the intersectionality of all these different issues that are an issue, again, of class war. Is a war of the elite against the working class. And so if we're able to be in spaces like that, deepen our analysis, there is a better possibility for us to develop a more complete strategy that allows us to be a political force in this country, to be a social force in this country, because we are the majority. And so I can't give, the 7 things to do when abortion, that's not how we operate. But but what I can say is that
If only it was that
we
easy.
miss this moment, if we miss this moment, which is a moment where a lot of young people are becoming politicized by the inactivity of the government. And when I say we, I mean the left. I mean the folks that are trying to move forward a socialist agenda, the folks that are on the progressive side. If we miss this moment of being the ones that orient what is happening in the streets, organizing it in a way that it becomes systematic, in a way that it becomes planned and intentionally politically, then we have ourselves ceded to the bourgeoisie. We have given the power to the bourgeoisie, and we can't continue to do that.
Let me just ask you this, a slight digression, but I think going back to, sort of a point we were touching on earlier, and, in the cultural terrain, I don't even like to call it this, the so-called pro-life movement. I mean, so much of their rhetoric is wrapped in this sort of Christian charity sort of reality, and what I personally would say is the weaponization of religious beliefs in order to promote something that is, about something else. But I was hoping you could talk about that, because that does seem like a big piece of this, because the way it's sort of presented, and I think to some degree why this so-called pro-life movement has to some degree been able to gain traction, is this sort of the negative pall they were able to place around abortion. Like, even for people who were for it, it was kind of like, well, it seems like it probably is bad, even if I think it's between a woman and her doctor, or it is bad, but I don't think the government should regulate it. Like, in some ways, even though majority of people have not agreed with these extreme views, they have sort of, in a cultural sense, people point this out all the time, for instance, how there's almost never any abortions in movies or TV, so-called liberal Hollywood. And sort of, anyway, this sort of battle of ideas, cultural aspect of this seems important in terms of how we reach people.
It's extremely important. It's extremely important. And I'll say, again, as a person of faith, as someone who has been within the institution of the church with the big C, that there's a huge responsibility to acknowledge that when we're talking about the church with the big C, the institution of the church, it comes from imperial and imperialist ideologies. And it's been a tool to be able to justify the abuses of power from empire and the states, capitalist states. And so when we think about the rules that come out of this institution of the church, they're not divorced from the state at all. Even though, we want to talk about the separation of church and state, that's complete nonsense. There's nothing more political than the church. And, we could have that show another time, but there is nothing more political than the church. And so when we're talking about these narratives about how wrong it is for a woman to have autonomy over her body, we have to also think about what capitalism meant, what slavery meant, and what reproduction meant to the capitalist system, the reproduction of human beings in relationship to labor. And so we cannot disconnect ourselves and think that, this is a matter of saving lives and it's a matter of that works in the moral realm, because it's not about that at all. It's about control. It's about giving control to the state and being justified somehow by a religious institution that wants us to be pacified, that wants us to be okay with it, even though we know it's not okay. I mean, when we talk about, there's a really dope documentary that came out called The Janes. Yeah. And it talks about, the way in which women during the 70s took on control and created community strategies around the issue of abortion, and actually were a pathway for abortion to happen. And it was obviously criminalized, like it's attempting to be criminalized now. And that seems to me like something Jesus would have done. At least the Jesus I know. He would have found a way where there was no way to make sure that lives were protected, that people lived in a dignified way. And if the church isn't promoting that, they're promoting the opposite, which means that the church becomes the enemy of the people. And in this case, you have multi-billion-dollar paid churches like the Olsen clan that are being paid by the Republicans, and that go out there and do campaigning. And you tell me what's godly about that. And so we need to be able to also analyze that narrative about the separation of state and church is plain BS. And that there's a narrative that progressive faith leaders need to counteract very firmly. Very firmly. This has nothing to do with divinity, and it has nothing to do with morality, and it has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with the same system that has displaced millions and millions of people from their land, from a system that has built colonies and processes of colonization, that has built slavery and the exploitation of millions and millions of people, billions, and is like responsible for genocide. Like that is what the church is and has been. And if we don't come to terms with that, then we are part of the enemies of the people. And we don't want to be that, because that's not what Jesus taught us. I mean, my Jesus is a Palestinian.
Right on.
Well, all very well said. All very well said. I
got me-
couldn't
you got
say
me
any
fired
better than
up.
that.
You
Yeah,
got me
no,
fired
that's
up.
the line has been drawn underneath
So we
where it
needed
is.
to hear. Yeah.
You know, if you're ever in New York City and wondering why you should come by the People's Forum, because that's the energy that percolates in the People's Forum. But Claudia De La Cruz, theologian, community organizer, popular educator, and co-executive director of the People's Forum, thank you for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Pleasure is all ours, you might say. Rania.
It really was actually. No, it really was all ours. That was like, I needed that. You need
Good.
that. You need to hear that. You need to get fired up about this issue. I hope that fired up our audience.
I hope so. I mean, I hope people, you know, around the country are. I mean, it's obviously, you know, there are systems, there are structures, and there are people, and there's an element to the historical process that's always abstracted out, that things that seem impossible often happen, and it is rarely because of processes and procedures. It's almost always because of the intervention of masses of people at an enormous scale, and that changes the calculus of everything.
So
But
go
let's make a
join
hard
an
pivot.
organization or community. Yeah, hard pivot time. Okay,
Hard
let's
pivot.
do it.
Still an important issue. But we want to turn to summit diplomacy, if you will, bloc diplomacy, whatever you want to call it. But we've had the Brics summit, of course, last week, and the G7 and the NATO summits over the past few days. And to discuss everything around this, so basically the future of our planet, we are very honored to be joined by Marco Fernandez, who's a researcher with the excellent Tricontinental Institute and also a member of the Dongsheng News Collective, also excellent, I have to say, and a member of the No Cold War campaign. Marco, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm fired up also by Claudia De La Cruz, which, by the way, it's a great comrade. It's an honor to be right after her. I'm in the other side of the planet. I'm in China, but she fired me up.
Right on. Well,
Wow, we're really international right now.
We are very
I'm just thinking,
international.
we're really international right now. I love it.
We are.
Okay.
China, Lebanon, New York. This is, I don't know, we should have clocks or something around here. But,
Yeah, really.
Well, Marco, let me ask you this to start. I mean, you know, even just from a presentation perspective, at least here in the West, you know, the Brics summit was like a footnote. I mean, even to call it a footnote might even be able to say a little too much. It was almost not in the media at all. The G7 is just like plastered all over everything. NATO plastered all over everything for days and days. And just that fact alone seems deeply incongruous to me with the actual sort of geopolitical state of play.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's of course a detail for the Western press. We're talking about the BRICS meeting, which represents 3% of the global GDP in PPP terms, which is the real GDP, and 20% of international trade. So of course, I mean, they're not going to waste their precious times, talking about 42% of the humankind. Well, despite of that, it happened. The BRICS happened in China, by the way, in Beijing. I mean, online, but officially hosted by China in Beijing. And it was, of course, a very important meeting. This is a meeting happening, I mean, in a particular moment of the history that we all know, everybody who's been following Breakthrough in the last months. I mean, everything was happening since the beginning of the Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine. You know, I mean, in this last few weeks, a lot of things happening, and it sounds, I mean, looks like sometimes it's the history speeding up, right, in front of our eyes. I think there is a sentence from a Russian politician called Vladimir, but not Putin, the old Vladimir, the Vladimir Lenin, that he had this great sentence saying, yeah, there are decades where nothing happens, but there are weeks when decades happen. and this seems to be happening in the last weeks in the whole planet. So, I mean, there's a lot of things going on, and the meeting at this moment of it's a crucial moment. First, I would say it's true that in the last years, BRICS had some hard time, especially because of the positions of India and Brazil. To be honest, I mean, Brazil is there, but much more formally. Bolsonaro president, extreme right-wing president Bolsonaro, doesn't have like plans for BRICS. Doesn't think BRICS is something that Brazil should put energy on. And by the way, I mean Bolsonaro has his external his foreign policy is absolutely a disaster, as everything else in his government. But at the same time, and at the same in India, of course, India also didn't in the last year since Modi actually so changed the position regarding BRICS. So BRICS didn't play like the full steam role that we expected to BRICS to play in the last years. I would say Brazil since 2016, since the coup against Dilma, is even before Bolsonaro. But even though it's still, if you talk about BRICS, you're talking about the biggest economy in the world, which is China in GDP, PPP. India is the third economy. Russia is the sixth economy. And Brazil is the eighth economy. And Africa, South Africa is one of the major economies of the continent. So you are talking about big countries and very important countries for the global economy. But right now, in spite of the problems with India and Brazil, right now what we have is a moment when, because of the war, because of the aggressive NATO towards all the whole global South, pressuring the countries to join the sanctions. By the way, none of the BRICS countries joined the sanctions against Russia, which is also a sign. And so there is like expectation again of BRICS having a major role in the next years. Well, first of all, BRICS is probably expanding. China proposed the expansion of BRICS in a few weeks ago when the foreign ministers, they met before the president. So China proposed, everything agreed. Right now, you have already two official applications. Is Argentina from have proposals or have discussions. Even Russia already said about, we should invite Turkey, Indonesia, Mexico. There's also like discussions about more African countries, maybe Nigeria, maybe Senegal. So clearly in the next months, we're gonna, this process of expansion is already on. And we have also one important thing, talking about Brazil right now, we are less than 100 days for the election, the president election, where former President Lula is again running for election and have a very, very good chance of winning the election against Bolsonaro. Well, if Lula wins, this is absolutely a game changer. It's not only for Brazil, not only from Latin America, but for the whole world. Lula already mentioned many times, if he wins the election, Brazil will come back full steam to CELAC, which is the regional platform, which, by the way, Brazil left in 2019. And also this is part of, because, why CELAC was like 4 years without any meeting since 2017. Fortunately, last year, President Mexico, López Obrador, and President Argentina, Fernandez, they led the reorganization of CELAC. They met last year, and they're going to meet again in December. So, if Lula wins, of course, BRICS, he already said, we are coming back full steam to BRICS. And even if India doesn't do the same exactly, but having Russia and China, of course, as close as ever. South Africa is showing more interest again. And if you have Brazil, then BRICS is definitely back. And with the proposal of expansion, we're going to have likely next year a different BRICS. And of course, in this moment where NATO is coming after the countries who are not aligned with them, they're expanding as
Right.
well, right? Finland and Sweden are joining this meeting that happening right now of NATO. We have Australia, Japan, and South Korea for the first time attending. So, I mean, I also think it's clearly like a different moment in history. Maybe it's a bit scary because the risk of a big war is already again on the table. But at the same time, it's an exciting moment because also of this situation that the war triggered. Clearly, the global South is getting aligned, and regional platforms like CELAC is coming back again. You have SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Asia. You have the African Union. You have ASEAN also very strong. So this is like a realignment of the forces from both North and Global South.
And before we move on to the issue of like the G7, which got so much attention in, some funny, silly ways, like the fact that they were wearing no ties. I don't know that in the US, for some reason, that caused so much controversy. I don't know why. Of all the things to discuss and take up airtime is the fact that they weren't wearing ties. But before we get into that, I just was wondering if maybe you could dive a little bit into the issue of India in its involvement in Brics, and it kind of does it poses a challenge. India's involvement in this group that includes China poses a challenge because the U.S. seeks to use India as this kind of bulwark against China, and it seems like the Brics arrangement would actually be like a bulwark against that.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean, I'm not a specialist in India, as you know. We have great comrades in India to talk much better about it. But one thing it's clear that of course India has this steel position, right? Because India is part of the BRICS, but it's also part of the Quad, which is these one of the alliance. Now there's many alliances against China. I mean, China is so strong that needs like 4 or 5 alliances. One alliance is not enough. So India is part of Quad with Australia, Japan, and US, but India is also part of BRICS. And of course, India has weird where relationship with China is very tense, and it's been very tense, especially in the last couple of years. But at the same time, India has very good relations with Russia. This is like long history since Soviet Union, since the national liberation struggles of India, independence in 1947. India is still like a big buyer of Russian weapons. They have very good diplomatic relations, and even sometimes when the tension between India and China got stronger in the last year or so, Russia sometimes comes to play the mediator because Russia is the only one who has friends of both and say, okay, guys, together, let's figure out. So has this sort of ambiguous role. But even in India, what's happening now, I mean, US and NATO, they're becoming so aggressive in their approach to the global South countries that even India, which is a ally of US, I don't know if you guys saw Vijay Prashad just published, I think a week ago or something, an article saying, okay, US cannot be good friends with its own alliance in allies in Asia, like India. And you had this very interesting interview from the foreign ministry relations of India, because Europe was complaining that, well, now India is buying Russian oil. They say, yeah, of course we're going to buy Russian oil. We need Russian oil, especially now with big discounts. And I'm sorry, Europe's problem, this war is Europe's problem. And Europe's problem are not Indian problems. So, guys, please, we're not going to... And also, I don't know if you saw, this is from yesterday, very interesting news, very rare. Looks like the first time that India is buying oil, but in yuan. this is the first time ever in the history that happens. Trade between India and Russia, not in rubles, not in rupees, but in yuan. So, I mean, the trying last move of NATO, even India, looks like it's coming back closer to Brics again. So this, I think, it's of course India is not going to like politics government as we know, but they are interested in, could be also aligned with Russia and Brazil and even China again. So I think this is a very interesting moment, and I think the what is it called, the chess is moving again. So let's see. It's a very moment of history and dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's sort of the weird paradox is sort of the most dangerous moments are also the ones that hold the most opportunity. Well, let me also just ask you this, is that, you look at the G7 meeting and it almost feels like it's like the ghost of China over their shoulder. And the big thing is, well, we've got our $600 billion. It's going to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, I wonder what you think about that in and of itself, whether the West can do it. But it really does feel that this is such a sign of the exhaustion of the Western model that essentially the whole agenda of the G7 seems to be, not positive, but essentially negative. Not what they're going to do, but what they're going to stop China from doing, basically, in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, these guys, they think that we don't have memory, right? So now they got this amazing partnership for global construction investment, $600 billion next 5 years. Do you guys remember where these guys? What were they doing 1 year ago in the G7 meeting that was in UK? They announced like, okay, now we amazing project against China. Finally, we're gonna win. Remember, there was the Build Back Better World.
Right.
That was 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago in June. They pledged 40 trillion US dollars to until 2035 to catch up infrastructure of the decade. But 2 years before that, Trump announced the America's Blue Dot Network with US, Australia, Japan. Also the same. Oh, now we have this amazing plan for infrastructure for the global south, and we are going to counter the Belt and Road Initiative from China. Before that, 2011, Miss Hillary Clinton was in Chennai in India, and she got this amazing idea of a new Silk Road to counter China. This was actually before the Belt and Road Initiative. And by the way, one thing we admit, good propaganda. The New Silk Road that we in Latin America, we still call New Silk Road in Portuguese and Spanish to talk about BRI. But this was actually a U.S. name. That was somebody made up this name in Washington and the corridors of Washington. But it was the same. I mean, it's been 10 years from time. This is a new genius plan to counter China and to finally create like a clean, democratic, transparent alternative to BRI. But guess what? Nothing happens. So I'm sorry, they don't expect us to believe that for the fourth time in 10 years, you guys come with another amazing package and amazing idea, and we are going to just here to wait. This reminds me, you guys are very active. You probably like a tweet viralized from Kenya, guys saying, the difference, the Chinese, every time the Chinese come to Kenya, we get a hospital. Every time the British come to Kenya, we get a lecture. Or we get like a piece of propaganda of amazing infrastructure plans. So Come on, guys, you should work better.
Yeah, it's really, it's you'd like to think it's amazing. It's it's not surprising, I guess, at this point when you see a lot of this, but it's just obvious that what you say is true, Marco. That that we're in a very big inflection point for the world, and it seems like the West is really just sort of living in the past and trying to hold on at all costs, but it does hold a lot of danger. Well, I really appreciate you being willing to give us your time here in the show. Hope everyone always is following Tricontinental, Dongsheng News Collective, and also No Cold War on a regular basis. But Marco Fernandez, thanks for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Eugene. Thanks, Rania. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And yes, whatever you need, whenever you need, just call us. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, yeah, Rania, it's just, amazing to see, to me, sort of the juxtaposition. And of course, we just had the Summit of the Americas, also a big failure for the United States. I mean, and again, even U.S. allies sort of looking at this and saying, like, what the hell is going on? Like, I mean, how could you be at this level? And it just shows the level of just intransigence of the U.S. ruling elite, that they don't even want to let their friends have a little bit of input into how things go, and in fact demand they destroy their own economies to, feed the beast of this attempt to destroy and quote unquote weaken Russia, or whatever they claim they're trying to do. They change it they're trying to win in Ukraine, they're trying to weaken Russia. Now they say they're not trying to weaken Russia, that Ukraine will have to give up territory, but they're still going to give them weapons. So it changes every day, but I think we know, it's a slow bleed strategy. But well, we covered a lot today, Rania. That's for sure.
We did.
Kind of ended up just now where we started in Ukraine.
Yeah, I also think it's all quite connected. You said something that really stuck with me just now before we let Marco go, and that was that you have these European countries in the U.S. really trying to stay in the past or like resurrect the past. And you see that happening, I think, domestically and internationally. Like that's what's happening internally in the U.S. You have these people trying to resurrect the past and strip away rights. And you have something similar taking place in the international arena when the world is moving forward.
Yeah.
And they're going to, and they can't, they can try all they want to stop that forward move, but just seeing like the sort of like clownish imagery coming out of the G7, Macron and Biden. And I always say it.
Who had a hot mic moment too, as well, where they were talking about what,
well, it was like a planned hot mic. That seemed to me like a planned hot mic moment. I'm like, you didn't know there was like 1,000 cameras. There was like 1,000 cameers around him. But anyways, yeah.
Hot mics will catch people. Every hot mic moment, it's like, how could they possibly not know? Yeah, you just don't. You wear so many mics, you forget sometimes. That's the problem.
I guess I should. Maybe I should be careful what I say.
You should be. Yes,
one day it'll be me.
I agree with that 100%. Well, that'll bring us to the close of the show here today. Remember, you can always go to patreon.com/breakthrough-news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough-news and become a patron. All of your ongoing support, deeply, deeply, deeply appreciated. Really appreciate everyone who's a patron so far, who's donated a single time in any possible way. Really appreciate you all. And we will be back with you again next week here on the Freedom Side.
Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.